Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Joining me is Ben Kinsley, co-producer and co-host. Ben, how are you?
Good, thank you.
And our special guest tonight is Adam Greshin, who is the Commissioner of Finance and Management. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we're going to talk about the end of the session, which surprisingly happened 2 days ago. What's this? Monday, Sunday, Saturday night, right?
It happened at just about midnight. I guess, I don't know if it qualifies as actually an ending on a Saturday.
Yeah, I think they were like 5 minutes past.
Yeah.
I think,
Oh, is that right? So
yeah.
it's maybe Sunday?
They passed the budget a few minutes before midnight, and then there are a number of speeches for retiring reps, and the minority leader thanks the majority leader, and the majority leader thanks the
Well, that must have kept you a while. There's a lot of retiring reps.
Yeah.
I was driving home during that.
Well, exactly. I have to tell you, I know we have a show to do, but one time when I was in the legislature, we were there till like 1:30, 2 o'clock at night. Remember that picture with Bill Doyle going like this to Howard Dean? It was in all the papers. So I get home, and you are so revved up.
Yeah.
I'm laying in bed, and I am yakking away. I couldn't come down. And my husband says to me, you have two choices. Either go sit in the TV room or keep quiet. He didn't say keep quiet, but you can fill in the blanks. And so I had to get up and go in the TV room. I couldn't. You get so wound up.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're tired, you're exhausted, but you're like, you've got all this stuff to do.
Yeah.
I was pretty surprised they even made their deadline, because like looking at the list of bills they still had Thursday night, I'm like, oh man.
Well, I think Don Turner made a deal with Mitzi about how many bills they would try to get done. So they put some kind of 9, I think, put a cap on them.
They did.
So
they named the bills specifically. They voted those through. They suspended rules to get them through.
Right, that's great.
And after that, they did the budget and the tax bill, or actually the tax bill and the budget, and went home.
Went home, good. And you were there.
I was there through the budget.
No,
Budget's done, we're done.
Okay. So before we get really into the meat of this, could you tell a little bit about your background? Because you've got quite an interesting one.
Yeah.
And why in heaven's name you said yes to this job?
Well, I moved to Vermont in '02 from the Boston area, and I think it was 7 years later. I had the wake up in the morning one day, and you're aggravated, and you say, I'm in. And I made the commitment to run.
Right.
And it was a pretty arduous campaign. I represented an area in the Mad River Valley that's, very progressive, very politically active. And people know the issues. They have strong opinions, as you know. And so it was a good campaign. But I was elected in the fall of '08. That was the election when Obama was first running. And it was right at the height of the Great Recession. I'll never forget that.
What do you say, right?
Yeah.
The entirety of my service was during rescissions and revenue downgrades and federal revenue coming in and then federal revenue going out. It was really a quite remarkable time.
Right.
And last year, after the first of a 2-year session ended, the phone rang, and the governor's staff wanted to know if I wanted to be Commissioner of Finance.
That's great.
And, it's not a job that I was anticipating or even waiting to do, but, two things. It's tough to turn a governor down. It's exciting serving in an administration. And I think Governor Scott is he is as honest as the day is long. What you see is what you get.
Right.
And fiscally, I think he and I are on the same page.
Now, you have a strong fiscal background, correct? I mean, numbers are your thing.
So
as opposed to some of us interviewing you at the moment.
Well, in the State House, actually, my first year as a freshman, the first part of my freshman year, I served on the Healthcare Committee, which in retrospect was one of the best things I ever did, because healthcare is blindingly complex. It is really hard to understand.
Threw you right in the fire.
Healthcare, all the different funding sources and all the different requirements, and that was a terrific boot up on one component of our economy, but an important one. And then after my first year, sadly, Rick Hubie died.
Oh, yes.
which opened up a seat on the Ways and Means Committee. So I took Rick Hubie's seat on the Ways and Means Committee, and I served there for another 7 years. And then 1 year on the House Education Committee.
Good for you. And here
So,
you
yeah.
are, Commissioner.
So here I am. I mean,
Yes. Now, when you first came on board, it was, I think, the former commissioner was sort of still, was he doing the budget? I was thinking this is your very first budget from beginning to end.
so when I first came to join the Scott administration, Commissioner Andy Polito
I'm sorry.
had just stepped down.
Right.
And he had served under Peter Shumlin, Governor Shumlin. And then he served for the first year under Governor Scott.
Right.
And he decided that he wanted to move on. Right. And so when I came in July, he had left the week before. So there was no commissioner. There was no deputy commissioner.
Excellent.
There was no budget director. Emily Byrne, who was the previous budget director,
right.
had moved to the Agency of Education. And we had no office administrator, and we were down 2 analysts. I mean, the department was entirely rebuilt over the past 6 months.
Wow.
And here,
Entirely
do the
rebuilt.
budget.
Right.
It's hard to come in as a new administration because the budget's sort of done for you
Right.
by the previous administration, and that's hard in itself.
And the office had Brad Ferlin, who, is one of these guys who knows a lot about a lot. He'd
Right.
served in government for 28 years at that
Right.
time. And he was just a big help.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Very swiftly after I came in, we hired Matt Ribbon to be my deputy,
Right.
who also had,
Matt,
he actually
he's
was
been
the
around.
budget director for
Yeah,
a number of years.
Right.
And he was currently serving in the judiciary. And then we hired, shortly after that, in the fall, we hired Rich Donahue to be our budget director.
Oh, great.
And he had come to us from the Agency of Human Services, Economic Services Division, and just very sharp guy.
You know, it's really good
So-
to have people like Jim Reardon, because he
Right.
came from Human Services. For those that are out in the field,
Right.
it's very hard to explain how the budget works and all this stuff. And so to have
Very.
somebody sitting there who actually knows,
Right.
it's good. So you've got a good staff.
So we have a good staff. We've got now, in fact, just hired 2 analysts to fill out our budget analyst corps. So starting next month, when they come to us, we'll be fully staffed.
Good for you. Great.
So we're looking forward to it.
Good.
But,
That's a tough job.
It is.
Yeah.
And, I think everyone saw a lot of headlines probably last week and last weekend around the budget and whether the budget was going to pass, whether the governor was going to veto the budget, and that was kind of all up in the air. Can you kind of summarize for us what happened to the budget after the governor proposed it back in January to, the budget that the legislature passed on Saturday?
Sure. So as is tradition, the budget is delivered by the governor towards the beginning of the session. And that happened the 3rd week of January. And then it is taken up by the House Appropriations Committee. Money bills are always taken up by the House first.
Right.
So the governor delivered his budget and his budget speech mid-January. House Appropriations took it up. And the budget that we delivered was a tight document. We used existing revenues only. We were very careful about that.
Good.
We allowed growth in the budget only so much as we had revenues to grow it. We didn't raise any additional revenues. One of the governor's first priorities is affordability.
Right.
And so he, since he came into office, he campaigned on the no new taxes, no new fees, and he's been true to that.
Yeah.
So we delivered a budget that used existing revenues.
No one-time funds?
We used about, I think, $8 million in total one-time funds.
Wow.
Which was
That's a good,
significantly
that's a good
down.
thing. Yeah.
He also, in the budget that was delivered, used for the first time what we call a growth rate calculation. And by that, I mean, we went back actually and looked at prior years' growth in average wages. And the theory being that budgets, state government, shouldn't grow faster than people's ability to pay for it.
There's a concept.
So, interestingly enough, I mean, you think it's logical, but
Right.
actually
No.
it raised a lot of eyebrows. And so The theory is that if people's wages are growing by, call it 2.36%, which is what we discovered looking back 6 years, then state government shouldn't grow any faster than that, or else you're becoming a larger part of people's wallets.
Right.
So we kept the growth to under 2.36%. It actually grew at 2.33%, which is a very tight growth rate. Although I will tell you, in the first budget that passed last year, in Governor Scott's first budget, overall growth was 1.5%.
Whoa.
So this will be the first governor in, I can't tell you how long, for as long as I've been involved, and far longer than that, where you've had a 2-year average growth rate of really sub 2%. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Right, that is.
But we still were able to carry out all the services that government needs. We made some decisions on programs that we didn't think were good to continue, that weren't achieving their goals. And we also made some decisions about adding some programs that we thought were important for economic growth, for helping the most vulnerable. So it was a tight budget, but it was a good budget. The House took our budget and added some of their priorities. They grew they added another $3 million to what we had added in terms of our growth, which was less than satisfying to us. But, you know, I think at the end of the day, I'd have to say it wasn't a prolific budget. I think they knew the parameters in which they were operating. So we took some issue with some of the decisions they made. We thought there was some fat in there that could be leaned out. But, you know, I think at the end of the day, it wasn't a bad budget. They delivered that to the Senate. The Senate took the House budget and added another couple $1 million. So net, there's about $6 million more spending than the governor had, a budget that grows about 2.7%, which we think is at the high end of what is comfortable to us.
Right.
But there again, I think, you know, the governor's kind of goalposts about, you know, growing the budget at a modest rate, you know, I think they grew it more than we feel comfortable with, but overall it wasn't a bad budget either. So that's the budget that was delivered.
But,
Well, there's a couple buts, right? Well, first of all, I wanted to clarify something. So when we say 2.3 or 2.7%, we're talking about general fund revenues? Or
That's correct.
Yeah.
So we're not talking global budget that includes
That's
federal
correct.
dollars. We're not talking education funds.
That's correct.
Okay.
We're talking about money that we can afford. There's really two measures of growth. One is the general fund, but keep in mind that we have other funds in government.
right.
So you often will see a number that is all funds with roughly $5.8 billion
Right.
approximately. Of that, $3.8 billion is state funds. Most of which, not all of which, but most of which we control. So when we look at all funds growth, we're talking about state funds. We don't strictly control federal dollars, of which we have a little over $2 billion of which. Now, I say strictly because the reality is we have some control over it. There are many programs within our budget that we opt into that have federal matching dollars.
Right.
Right.
So when you opt into, for example, you know, a classic program that we all know and love is Medicaid. Now, Medicaid is a program that is very important for people of low and modest income. And it's a federal state program. So there's a federal match with state dollars that are spent. But we know when we opt into Medicaid programming that there is federal dollars there and we have to meet certain federal requirements. And we also know, we go in with eyes open, that the federal government could change at any time the parameters of those programs. Federal highway dollars, same thing. I mean, you know, federal highway, in fact, has a much larger federal match. So there are federal dollars in there. We don't control them, you know, strictly speaking, but by opting into these programs, we really are saying that we would like to draw down
Right.
federal dollars. And, you know, there are times when federal dollars start to disappear.
Yes, they do.
But, you know, I think to more fully answer your question, for all funds, all state funds, it's about $3.8 billion.
Now, when you
Right.
say that number, is that transportation, capital budget, those two, is that included in that
It
number?
includes the state component of transportation,
Okay,
which is
and-
about $350 million. Total transportation dollars is well over $600 million, but
Yeah.
$350 million
Right.
is state controlled. It includes the capital bill, but that's those are borrowed funds. Those aren't appropriated funds. They're borrowed and
Yes,
appropriated.
of course, I knew that.
But it includes the general fund, the transportation fund, special funds, which are substantial.
Right.
You know, those are all kinds, like, you know, fish and wildlife
wildlife,
fees you
right.
pay, state healthcare resources fund, which is used to match, pull down federal dollars.
Yep.
You know, all kinds of small funds for A&R.
And you're responsible
like.
for all of them, Commissioner.
them.
Well, and the big one
Excellent.
too is the education fund, right?
Yes.
Which
And
is,
it includes the education
which
fund.
is the big kid on the
The big
block.
one.
It is our largest fund. However, with the education fund, I always make the distinction that, you know, we manage the general fund very carefully. We manage the transportation fund very carefully. But the general fund and the transportation fund combined do not equal the education fund.
Right. I'm talking.
And we don't manage the education fund. In fact, I would argue it manages us.
Yeah.
So-
which is probably true. I think, you know, it's kind of, and there's some ambiguity there, right? Because the education fund is the cumulative, you know, funds of all of the budgets that are passed at the local level.
Correct.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. And so really, the local level drives the spending. Local level doesn't always drive the tax rate. That's kind of, there's several factors that affect that.
Right. And the way the education fund works, as you said, after Act 60, which is our statewide education funding program, really the state is cast in a passive role there. By that I mean schools pass their budgets. We add up the compilation of school budgets.
Right.
And that's the amount of money we raise. And we set a property tax rate to raise that
raise
money.
that,
Yeah.
So the state is in a passive role there. We're not managing that fund. With the general fund, we first determine how much money we have, and then we determine how to allocate it. With the education fund, we first determine how much money we have to allocate, and then we raise the money to do it.
Right.
It's really
That's a better way to
backwards.
explain it to the citizens who
it's an
still don't
interesting-
understand it.
It's an interesting dynamic because
Yeah.
you have, you know, like for example, in the legislature, you have the Appropriations Committee and you have the Ways and Means Committee in the House. You know, and the Appropriations Committee is the one that decides how to spend the money, and Ways and Means figures out how to pay for it. But they're a part of the same body. They're part of the legislature,
That's
right?
correct.
And education funding, it's not really set up that way because the local school budgets or local school districts, you know, and their school boards are totally divorced from the legislature who has to figure out how to pay for it, even though those budgets are being voted at on the local level.
It brings to mind an interesting parallel. Over the past years, you may have heard, I'm going to say 2 or 3 years ago, there was a bill passed in the legislature that required the governor's office to fill out or calculate a people's budget.
Oh, I remember that
And it was the
exercise.
brainchild, I believe, of Washington County Senator Anthony
Yes, and
Polina.
right.
And the idea is, instead of figuring out how much money we have to spend and then allocating it to answer various needs, let's figure out what our needs are first, and then find the money to answer those needs.
Great.
Well, if anyone wants to know how that would work out, look at the education fund.
Right.
Because in the education fund, that's what we do. School
Right.
boards determine what their needs are, and we raise that money.
Yep.
And I don't have to tell you that the education fund has grown. You know, when I first got to Vermont, the general fund was substantially larger than the education fund. And now
Now,
it's
a little
substantially
reversed.
smaller.
Yeah.
So, you know, the education fund has grown substantially, and that's because we're not managing it. It's managing us.
Yep.
So I always like to tell people the next time they hit a pothole on the road, think about the cost of education. Because money from the transportation fund, your purchase and use taxes, which
Right.
normally go to the transportation fund, is transferred to the education
Right.
fund. The next time someone comes to tell you that there is a need in the human services area for example, early childhood education
Right.
and how we're underfunding it, think about the cost of pre-K through 12 education.
There you
Because we transfer roughly a quarter, little less than a quarter, 20% of the general fund we transfer immediately to the education fund. So the fact that we're not managing the education fund really means it's managing us, because all these other sources of funds are being pulled into the education fund to pay for education.
Right.
Which is really why, which, you know, gets to your point about the budget really wasn't the end of the story that we
Right.
submitted. You know, it's really why this governor, when he first took office, decided we have to do something about
Right.
this. We just have to.
Yep.
And I would say, I think honestly you could say that Governor Scott is the first governor that's taken on the challenge of the education fund. to try to manage that fund.
Yep.
And
I told you before that I hope that something happens over the summer that keeps this conversation going, because, I mean, this issue has been around forever. And people, every campaign, what you hear is the property tax is too high, and it is. And somebody's got to do something about it. I don't know what that is, but we've got the brains in this state. We just have to
Figure
put them in a
out.
room and lock it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
you know, the challenge, it always starts from the same goal. Everyone wants to educate our kids. I
Right.
mean, no one doubts
Right.
that education is important to the future of the state, and not only to the future, but to the present. To get people to move here, you have to confirm to them that you'll educate their
Good
children.
schools, that's it.
And so no one doubts that, the importance of education. But we looked out, and you know, the governor was very clear about kind of looking at comparables, and you know, we have the lowest staff to student ratios in the country. And what that means is we have more adults, more staff members in the school buildings per student than any other
Right. And that's
state.
the teachers, not necessarily including administration.
If
That's
you-
another whole
Well,
It
calculation.
is.
Yeah.
Well, we have a very low student-teacher ratio, but we have a very low staff-student
Right.
ratio. So, you know, we have too many buildings, and we have too many people in those buildings. And it's not a question of whether we can deliver a quality product.
right.
There are many other states that deliver a quality product, sometimes even better quality
Right.
product, with fewer adults
Yeah.
in the buildings. So it's not a question of whether we think education is important. Of course we do, but we have to deliver it efficiently. And you know, this governor has asked us to come up with a plan that will deliver a good product, in fact, an improved product, more cost efficiently.
That's great, that's great.
So,
Because I think the
Big
more money,
problems to
more
solve.
people is approach, which I've heard for years in state government, give me more money, give me more people,
Sure.
is not necessarily the answer in all cases.
Well,
As
and this is
matter
a
of fact,
case
usually
where
not.
I think most people would agree that we need to reduce our, you know, the number of adults in school buildings. The really the rub is how do you get there,
Right.
you know, and that's the difficult piece that people have struggled with.
Just want to ask you, you mentioned the budget. It's passed and it's been approved by the House and Senate, but there's talk that the governor may veto it. Is that a true statement? Oh, look at the face.
only governors decide
Only
whether they're going
governors.
to
We
veto
don't
or
know
not.
whether he's going to do that.
But so the rest of the story with the budget is the budget itself, and you know, I can take credit for predicting this early on. The budget itself, the general fund budget itself, became kind of a second-tier issue, really, in part because the budget we delivered was tight. We had some issues with the House and the Senate budgets, but overall, they were not as problematic as past budgets have been. So that became a bit of a lower-tier story. The bigger story became, once again, the education fund,
Right.
in that the education fund had roughly a $58 million gap between available sources of revenue
Right.
at current tax rates and uses of that revenue, which means all the school budgets that were passed. So the way it normally works is that that amount of money, $58 million, is retrieved through higher property taxes. That's the way it works every year.
Right.
Well, the governor, keep in mind, came into office saying there will be no taxes and fee increases at all. And he was asked many times, Governor, does that also include the property tax? And his answer, without any
Yep.
question, was yes, it does.
Yep.
So he was, from the beginning of the session, very clear that if there is a need to raise property taxes in the education fund, that's not going to happen on my watch. We have to find a way to fill that gap in the fund between sources and uses without raising property taxes. And so as we got towards the end of the session, it became increasingly clear that the legislature was not interested. Now, early
not
in,
interested
was
in-
not interested in going along with the
Oh,
no
okay,
new
right,
taxes.
right.
Early in the session, anticipating this, we submitted a plan that had, I believe, 16 different ideas
Yes.
for the legislature to consider. We wrote a letter to the legislature. We said, here are some ideas. We would like to work with you on any or all of these ideas, but you have to accept the parameters that all of these could be good or bad ideas, but at the end of the session, we're going to have to fill a $58 million gap.
Right.
At that point, it wasn't. It looked to be more like a $45 million gap, so it grew over time. But we said these are ways to do it. Some of these ideas you may like, some of them you may think are dopey, but one way or the other, we're not going to walk out of here without. Well, again, as the session wore on, it became clear that the legislature was not interested in working with the governor on closing
Right,
that gap.
right.
Interestingly enough, some of the ideas they took up. To their credit. One of the ideas we spoke about was a different way of delivering and paying for special education. And you have to give credit where credit's due. The House Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee did a lot of work on that, and they came up with a great plan. So,
Can you summarize that? I'm not sure that I got that one out
The
of
block grant,
Oh, the block grant.
Right.
Oh, we
Yeah.
talked about that, sorry.
H911.
Yep, right.
although it wasn't, block grant has kind of mixed terminology. I think it was poisoned by the whole idea of block granting Medicaid dollars. But
Right.
yes, what it does is, right now we pay for special education kind of in a per pupil
pupil,
basis.
right.
So if a school district identifies a child in need of special help, the school district will receive from the state through a grant 60% of the cost of that extra help.
Right.
The district itself will pick up 40%. After a certain level for children in very high need, once it gets to a certain payment over $50,000, the state steps in and pays 90% once you get over the 50,000 threshold. So that's the way it's done, but it's done on a per student basis. So
Right.
what the census method of payment would be is you look at regional and national census levels, and you look at the number of special needs kids within populations, and you determine what a typical population of this size and of this demographics and so on would have in terms of special needs students and the cost of that, and you block grant that amount per district. So what that does is it incents districts to work with their students better. It doesn't incent them to identify students who may or may not actually require special attention.
Right.
But because more payment would be coming for the state for those students, they may be incented
So
to.
if a
This
family
changes
moved
it.
into a town unexpectedly before school and they have, this is an actual where they have 2 or 3 special needs kids,
Mm-hmm.
this block grant would be able to accommodate.
That's correct.
Oh,
Well, the
'cause I
block
know-
grant also applies to the SU level because that's where all special education
Right,
funding
at
at
the
this point
SU
is out of
level.
the. So an
Yeah.
individual town is not going to be hit by that
Yeah.
regardless, even if they don't trigger.
'Cause I
the
just remember a
threshold.
story
That's
from
correct.
years ago when a town was just pretty much wiped out because a family moved in with several special ed kids, which they weren't anticipating, and they were in real financial straits.
Well, especially if you already passed the budget, and then
Yeah,
you
well,
just go back
exactly,
and be
that's
like,
what
oh,
happened.
you know,
So
if
they're
the-
like,
And to Ben's point, one of the benefits of Act 46, which is our school governance changes that were instituted, again, at legislative initiative several years ago, to their credit, it's to create larger governance units, precisely
Right, which
because
makes
you could
sense,
have a
may I
small
say.
town of,
Yeah.
with 100 kids in a school, and you get 3 kids who move in with special needs, and suddenly you're crushing their
Right.
budget.
Right.
Right.
So this creates larger governance units, larger payment units, and there's safety in numbers when it
That
comes
makes
to that.
sense.
Yeah, and most of the services like special education is an easy one, but bulk buying of goods and contracting
Right.
for services, a lot of that was done even before Act 46 had gone through, and Act 46 was kind of like the next step of, all right, you've pushed all these services up the SU level, we're going to start consolidating some of your smaller administrative districts.
Right.
As kind of the next step to that.
So
Correct.
Commissioner, back to the veto issue. I won't hold you to it if he is or isn't, but if he does veto the budget, he has to call a special session because the leaders of the legislature said they're not going to schedule a vote day. So he has to call a session. If his veto is not sustained, we don't have a budget, correct? And we would have to do some, what do they call it? So, continuing funding for state government?
Well, if his
How does
veto
that
is
work?
sustained, then
Then-
we have to work out a new budget.
Oh, okay.
If his veto is overridden, then we have the
We
budget that the House
Okay, I
and
said
Senate
it
passed.
backwards, sorry.
The special session would be in theory, after a veto.
Right.
It
Right,
doesn't have
right,
to be.
right.
The governor can call a special session for any purpose.
Yes, right.
But the idea would be, if he called a special session, it would be to work towards agreeing with the
And
House and Senate.
does
over a
anything,
budget.
I don't know this, and I should, does anything go at a special session? I mean, you
Anything
can
goes.
bring up any bills,
Yeah.
anything? It's just
It's-
like a regular day
it's
in
like a
the
new
life
session.
of a legislature?
Right.
It's like a
so
new
it's-
session.
So
Interesting.
you can bring up bills that have gone down in the past. You can
Do anything
clean
you want.
slate.
I mean, in theory, you could also the legislature can elect new officers if they want. They generally
Whoa.
wouldn't do that,
Yeah,
but I mean,
that'd be
it's a new session.
Have a new Speaker of the House for
You could have a new speaker, a new pro tem. I mean,
I hope I'm here for that.
that'd be interesting.
Just
so-
kidding, folks.
So
I
what's-
wouldn't anticipate that. but-
What was the thinking? Because the legislature basically said, we're not going to schedule a veto session. We're going to let the governor call a special session. What was the thinking behind that, or is that kind of still a guessing game at this point?
Well, I wasn't in the legislative rooms when they decided that, but my guess would be the thinking behind that is to give themselves maximum flexibility,
Right.
so that a special session, again, is an open session, anything's game, so you can call up bills that never made it to the finish line. You can devise, pass, and send to the governor new bills.
Right.
But I think number two, I think they also wanted to create the impression that the onus is on the governor.
Yeah.
They've already
And
passed their bill,
A
they
veto
went
session
home.
would mean only the budget?
It would mean whatever
Limited.
bills that
Yep. Oh,
have been
interesting.
vetoed.
Huh.
So
Right.
I think they were looking to give themselves flexibility, and I
makes
think they
sense.
were looking at the optics of it and saying, well, we've done our work. We passed a responsible budget, we're going home. So Governor, if you don't accept that, it's on you. I mean, I think that's the whole idea,
Right,
what they're trying
right.
to say.
And there were two things that happened revenue-wise that kind of changed the calculus from when the governor proposed his budget to when the legislature passed theirs. There was this $30 million from the federal tax changes that the state would have received if they didn't change their tax code. Most of that we did end up giving back, except for I think a small piece that we used to pay down
Social Security.
Social Security, right? So it's to alleviate the tax on Social Security benefits, and the rest of it we basically gave back through tax rates.
Right.
And so I don't know if you want to talk more about that
Right.
and what that looked like.
So actually, there were two major changes to the revenue picture once the governor delivered his budget in January. I believe it was maybe late February, early March, the Attorney General's office announced that they had reached a settlement with tobacco companies
Right.
to clear up something like 10 years worth of
Right.
litigation.
Right.
So they reached a one-time settlement to bring all litigation up to present. And that resulted in what actually, interestingly enough, was originally thought to be a $28 million settlement that would come in the form of a check
Nice.
to be used any way we want. And, in the vast history of my participation in government, I've never seen a $28 million check promised and $34 million actually arrived.
Excellent.
So I'm not
Don't
really
tell them.
sure
I hope
what.
you cashed it.
So we cashed it quickly. I'm not sure what turned 28 into 34. But so we got $34 million that we did not anticipate when we delivered the budget to be used anyway the legislature and the governor sees fit. In addition, the federal tax reform that you mentioned earlier resulted in a fairly substantial amount of both income tax increases in income tax payments and particularly corporate tax payments
Right.
from repatriation of assets. And Vermont is just a smidgen in the corporate universe, but
Right.
A smidgen from a very large sum of money can mean
Can be
decent
good
amount of
bucks,
money.
Yes.
And also, I think the economy is growing quite healthily.
Yep.
So everything added together amounted to a very large surplus that we did not anticipate in the
Wow.
general fund. Estimated recently to be about $44 million.
Excellent.
I was going to say,
Good
because there was
for
a second
us.
piece of that. There was
Yeah.
there was the federal tax income change piece of it, and then there was a revenue upgrade,
Right.
which came, I think, just like 2 weeks ago.
It did, and that was the general fund surplus.
The
That
general
was-
fund surplus.
Nice.
Yes.
So that money was in the bank, but in theory, until the emergency board that does revenue projections accepts that money,
Right.
accepts the fact that it's in the bank, and agrees that it's there and
Then
it's
you
to
can't
be
touch it
used,
until
you
they do.
shouldn't touch it.
Yeah.
Everything is contingent. So there was an emergency board meeting last week, Monday, where they accepted that amount of money. So for fiscal
Interesting.
18, for the current fiscal year that runs
Right.
out next month.
Yep.
So here you have $34 million of tobacco money, another $44 million at a minimum. It's probably going to end up being more than that when the year finally runs out.
And that'll-
$44 million all added to the $34 million,
Wow.
and the fact that in the July forecast from last year, we had organic growth, in the economy in general.
Right.
So
Right.
even though we're not raising income taxes, you still might pay more income taxes if you get a raise, or if you get a second job. So you have this organic growth in the economy anyway. So according to our calculation, there's something like, I don't know, 150 or more $1 million of additional money
Right.
that came in either through just regular old boring economic growth or surplus general fund money or tobacco unexpected, one-time settlement money. So this is all coming in on, after we submitted a budget. And
Right.
it led us to wonder to ourselves, why would we raise property taxes to fill that gap in the education fund when we've got all this money burning a hole in our pocket?
From 2018, that's going to roll over into
Exactly.
2019.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So why are we going out to property owners and saying, I'm sorry, we have to fill a hole in the education
right.
fund. You have to raise your property taxes to do that. So, we submitted a plan
Right.
at the end of the year, or not, it was the end of April when we finally figured out that the legislature was going to raise property taxes to fill the education fund. We
Knowing this
said,
money was coming in.
knowing, they already knew the money was there. So we said, look, why don't we do two things? First, let's take some of that money that's one time, we're not anticipating it again,
Right.
and let's use it to fill the hole in the education fund to stabilize property tax rates.
Yep.
But as important, in fact, I would argue more importantly, let's put in place a plan so that we're not sitting here at this time next year,
Yep.
as we did
There's a
last year, by
concept.
the way. I should
Long-range
say.
plan?
A long-range plan
Be
to
still my heart.
stabilize
Yeah.
property taxes over 5 years,
Yep.
to institute structural reforms and reforms to our property tax adjustment system. That will mean that not only will that money that we're giving from the general fund to the education fund will stabilize property tax, we'll be able to pay it back. So
Wow.
that is really a two-part plan. There's all this focus on, wow, we're giving one-time general fund money to the education fund to buy down property tax rates. Yeah, we are. But we're also instituting a 5-year plan that will make sure that those rates don't go up again. And we are able to repay it. And with the extra money from this reform, we'll be able to have enough money set aside to reinvest in other areas of education. Higher ed, tech ed.
Great. Yeah, higher
So,
ed.
it's kind of an all-in.
Yeah.
And we just keep scratching our heads thinking, what's wrong with this? Why wouldn't you
Where
do it?
did they want to put the money, dare I ask?
Well, they want to raise property taxes.
Right.
So the ed fund will be stabilized through higher property
Right.
taxes. And they want to take some of the one-time money and make a down payment, or not make a down payment, and make a payment towards the teacher's retirement system. Which is not, as fiscal measures go, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
But, there are a couple of problems with that. One, the unfunded liability is about $1.5 billion. So making a $3 million payment towards it is not going to retire it. But the other problem we have with it is we're not actually going to see the return on that until 20 years hence. So here we're offering a plan that will give you an immediate 5-year return on education funds.
Right.
Instead of, they're saying, put in $33 million to the teacher's retirement system and you'll save approximately $90 million 20 years from now. We're saying, well, put put $58 million into the education fund, and you'll see a $300 million return over 5 years and payback within 5 years, not 20 years.
So that was the.
So you'll see actually a payback that's 3 times the size of the teacher's retirement system payback, and you'll see it in 5 years, not 20.
So what are the levers, policy levers that you have to pull in the education funding equation to make those savings realized within the 5-year time frame?
Well, as I said, there are some structural reforms and there are some property tax adjustment mechanism reforms. The structural reforms that we pointed out are really threefold, 3 major ones. The first is, let's get together a task force and determine how we're going to move from the current staff-student ratios we have
Right.
to more national level. And actually, I shouldn't even say that. Just, I would say to more economic levels of staff in the buildings that
For
would still
Vermont.
leave us
Right.
the highest staffed state in the country, but just move us up towards more, I would say, out of the nosebleed levels. So how do we get to ratios that are more appropriate and use some scale in these districts? So that's the first thing, readjusting our staff-student ratios. The second change was to make good on an initiative from last year that you
80-20. and
you
how-
may remember
Yep.
was just the crux of the end of last session
Right.
that kind of held everything up. Move to a statewide school employees health care
Right.
contract
Right.
that not only institutes reforms to how much is paid by employer versus employee, but also takes what amounts to about 150 different healthcare contracts
Right.
for all of our school districts and make it one contract, which ensures equity across the state.
Right.
You know, it's not like salaries that might be, say, higher in Chittenden County and lower in Caledonia County. Healthcare is a commodity.
Yeah. But
You know,
some places are still paying for all the teachers.
That's correct.
Like I think Chittenden County is.
I don't know which districts
yeah,
are and aren't, but
yeah.
there's lots of variation in
Right.
terms of how much they
Yeah.
pay. But equally important, there's variations on out-of-pocket amounts
Oh.
and who pays first dollar out of pocket, on whether the districts have an HRA, a health
Yeah.
HRA, health retirement account versus a health savings
Yeah.
account, whether those monies roll over into the new year or whether they all have to be spent in 1 year.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of
Not
differences.
as easy as it sounds, is it?
It's very complicated.
Yeah.
But partly the complication is an advantage at the negotiating table because many of these districts really don't know all the moving parts.
Right.
But if you have one statewide health care contract and it's negotiated by a council or a board or the state, whereby they know all the moving parts, it comes out much more efficiently. It guarantees equity
I
across
was
the
going to say, and
state.
there's got to be savings in
And
a
it
pot
should
this
save-
big rather than individual
That's correct.
little pots. I mean,
And you
that's
get
just common
economies of
sense.
scale.
Yeah.
So
right.
that's the second structural reform that we think should be important.
Yeah.
And that one got some attention from the Senate Education Committee. They were taking testimony on that the last 2 weeks of the session.
That's correct.
So there's definitely something that's on their radar.
It is. They never quite got to the finish line, but we hope to push that in special session. And the final structural reform we'd spoken about a bit earlier is special education,
Right.
how we pay for it and how we
Right.
deliver it. But you know, the combination of those 3 reforms saves something like almost $200 million
Wow, that's amazing.
And,
on a net
That's
basis.
amazing.
On a gross basis, it saves almost $400 million.
Oh, it'd be hard to turn that down. If,
Well,
I don't think the
exactly.
public understands all of this because I think what the governor presented as his 5-year plan, there's a lot of misconception out there of what it is, I think.
Well, I think you're right, and part of it is, you know, the idiosyncrasies of education are not easy to
no,
explain.
right.
I mean, it's very difficult to kind of boil down very complex ideas into simple statements. But if I were to do that, I would say make these investments and realize long-term savings that can be reinvested in education or returned to taxpayers.
Right.
Either one.
And the legislature did adopt the H 897, which was the census-based special education funding
That's
model.
correct.
Is that in line with what the administration was hoping they would do, or were you hoping for more?
We are broadly in favor of that. We think they did a good job. We had some quibbles here or there, but we think they did a good job, and I think the administration will embrace what the House and Senate passed.
So they've got one of the three, at least, pieces that you're...
One of the three.
Yeah.
They've debated ad nauseum health care. We hope to push that over the finish line. And with a task force, we hope to start making changes in our staffing ratios.
And is there any push to look at the funding formula? Also, I know that's been a topic of discussion in the legislature. There's even a part of H911, which was which dealt with education funding, that originally, with the version that came out of the House, that would have kind of changed the scale for how much impact local towns see on their tax rates based on their school budget. Kind of start reconnecting those dots that a lot of people would say were broken in Act 60.
Right. So I mentioned there were structural reforms and changes to the property tax adjustment mechanism. And interestingly enough, the House, in their tax bill, education finance bill, made a number of changes that we had advocated for, and some actually that they had advocated for that we agree with. So there were a couple of changes. One, which actually the House passed and the Senate punted, and the conference committee brought back in, was to change the house site value from right now $500,000 to $400,000. And by that I mean,
That's the cap.
That's
right,
correct.
For income sensitivity.
that's correct. So right now, if you live in a house that's $500,000 or less in assessed value, you can, if your income is below or equal to a certain level, you can pay based on your household income, a percentage of your household income, as opposed to what your assessed value of your house is. After your assessed value exceeds $500,000, you would pay based on your income up to $500,000 of assessed value, and then the full tax rate over $500,000. And there's arguments could be made that why are we subsidizing people to live in homes equal to $500,000? Maybe that's a bit excessive. No, I can tell you, no other state has anywhere near that
Really?
kind of, nothing close. So the House moved down the house site value from $500,000 to $400,000. So up to $400,000 of assessed value you can pay based on income. Over $400,000, you pay
value.
your full assessed
Interesting,
value.
interesting.
So, yeah, I mean, it's, I think, one good change. Another change they made is a change in how you calculate the slope. So,
Yeah.
you know,
It's the Beck Amendment.
no, that actually is something entirely different. So kind of the bad economic policy, bad tax policy is a cliff. You know,
Oh,
you've heard of the
yes.
famous
Well, that's
benefits
been a big
cliff.
issue for years
Right.
here, right?
So
We
you
reached the
make,
cliff.
you know, X amount of money, and if you make X amount of money plus $1,
right.
you
Oh, right.
get
Yeah,
your
right,
benefit
the cliff.
Well,
Yeah.
with property taxes, kind of the magic number is $90,000 of household income. So if you make $90,000 and $1 of household income, you know, without a so-called slope, you'd be cut off. And so magically what you'd find is everyone's making $89,999.
How did that happen?
Anything you can do to
Right.
get under that
Exactly.
night, right?
So in their wisdom, policymakers created what's called a slope after $90,000. So after $90,000, what you do is you take your house site value of 250 or below, and you subtract your household income from that. And that is the level at which you will pay.
Interesting.
So it's a little hard to explain in
Right.
a couple of
You need some
seconds.
diagrams, right?
But what it means is you can earn in current law up to about $147,000 and still
And still
qualify
be-
for some adjustment.
Oh, I think some people will be
And-
happy.
What the House did in H911 is they cut that down to what will amount to about $118,000.
So it's a
And then-
steeper
so it's
tail.
a steeper
Steeper.
tail, right?
Yeah.
A steeper slope off. So that too will actually save a substantial amount of money
Yeah.
in property tax adjustments. What we had proposed, but never made it to the finish line, but someday I would love to see happen. You know, we've worked for years over trying to fix the income sensitivity
Right.
property tax adjustment.
They were
It's
talking about
very-
eliminating that this year, right?
The House very briefly talked
Yeah.
about that, and they decided what past Houses and Senates have decided, and past administrations, frankly, have decided, and that is that it's really, really hard to make any change in the property tax adjustment mechanism without hurting someone. You know, the proverbial
There's a reason why
kicking
they
the old
get money.
lady out of her
Yeah.
house.
Right.
You know, who's on Social Security
Right.
and lower income, and she's living in a house that's appreciated dramatically. You know, do you really want to kick grandma out of her house? And
Right.
of course the answer is no. No one wants to do that. But it's very, very hard to change the mechanism without hurting someone. So
Yeah.
our idea was, okay, let's accept the fact that we have a very complex system that is beloved by a number of people, that is hard to change. Let's, however, wipe the slate clean as of a certain date, say July 1, 2018. We start a new system. So anyone that buys a house or moves from one house to another, changes properties, after July 1 is subject to a new system.
So
That
it's-
is
they have to
change.
take an action. They have to
Yes,
do something.
exactly right.
So those of us staying in our house and,
Anyone who's
okay,
staying in their house,
Right.
doesn't move, is
Same system.
grandfathered into the old system.
I
But
like the concept
starting the
already.
new year, we have a new system. And that new system will be according to, well, whatever parameters we decide are right.
It's interesting.
But it kind of sets the clock back to zero.
right.
Right.
And so over time, you'll have more and more people that'll be moving out of, you know, the old system and into the new system. And, you know, the criticism was, well, then we'll have two parallel systems. But first of all, tax department said no problem. It's all automatic.
Right.
And, you know, from someone, and I don't know if you guys too, someone who for years lived in a town that had rent control. Remember?
Oh, rent control, yes, New York City, rent
New York
control,
City.
to die for.
I lived in Brookline, Mass.
Yeah, there you go.
Cambridge, Mass.
Yep.
You know, there you had two parallel systems existing side by side for years.
Right.
So it's not rocket science.
Right.
Anyway, the House did not go for that, nor did the Senate. But in my fond world, that would happen too.
Right.
So anyway, we had a number of proposals, but what ultimately came out of the conference committee were two major changes. One to the house site value that will qualify for property tax adjustment,
Right.
and another to the slope after $90,000. So there are substantial changes. Ultimately, they net to the education fund about, I think it's $13 million of,
Oh, my God.
of lower costs. So
So is this, what you're talking about now, is this the tax bill that, or, because that's not all in the
Yeah.
bill, it's in the tax bill.
It's in
Is the
H911.
governor going to veto that? Because it sounds like some good ideas in there.
there are some good ideas. The governor would like to figure out a way to get to yes without vetoing
Good,
it. But
good.
also in that bill is a property tax hike of roughly $34 million, because some of the changes they made cut back on that $58 million number.
Right, right.
So,
Oh.
you know,
So who sets the agenda for the special session? Is that the speaker and the Senate pro tem? Is that who sets the agenda? Or, I guess I
think
don't know,
so.
how does this work? Because you said something about, we want to talk about that in special session. How do you make that happen? You work through the legislators and,
the
interesting.
special session is called by the governor,
Yeah.
but the speaker and the pro tem
Yeah.
set the agenda.
Right,
I mean, it's an interesting,
yeah, because that's
yeah. I
interesting
mean,
dynamics. We'll have to pay attention. We have 4 minutes left, and I want to make sure that you've talked about everything, because I have to thank you profusely for Money for Tech Ed. It is a passion of mine, and I'm so thrilled that finally, I love Representative Botsow. That economic development bill was great. It was a very good bill.
So, you know, in the budget, there were a number of kind of down to the wire decisions, one of which, as we've spoken about quite readily, has been the education fund and how we're
Right.
going to fill that gap. But one of them was the economic development piece
Right.
that was kind of in, then it was out, then it was in, then it was out. And keep in mind, last year, when we had a slight budget surplus of about $6 million, the governor, during budget adjustment, when this surplus became accepted, made a proposal to take half of that $6 million surplus and create an economic development program that we called Think Vermont
Right.
Move. that had a number of initiatives in it, but really addressed what is one of our major challenges in the state of Vermont, and that is a demographic challenge. So
He's talked about that a lot.
he has, and one of his priorities is building the labor force.
Yep.
I mean, it's in many ways it's a nice problem to have in that we have more jobs than people to fill them, but it also is a tough challenge to have because there are people out there who are looking for work, but they don't necessarily match the skills that are looked for. But also, we just need a larger pool of young people, not just young people. I mean, young people, old people, big people, little people. We just need more people who are available for the workforce. This includes, by the way, retirees who can come back into the labor force.
I heard a new term this year.
People like you.
I heard a new term this year, and I think it's, I'm going to try to get it right, but returnship.
Oh, return, yes, returnship, right.
Yeah, as opposed to an internship,
not.
it's people who are returning to work
It's
after
those
being
60
retired.
hours a week you work that would do me in, Commissioner.
Well, it doesn't have to be actually people working 60 hours a week, but it could be people who want to work part-time.
Right, share.
It could be people in our corrections institutions who will re-enter the workforce.
Right.
It could be young people who may have had a job and taken time off to go back to school, who we can coax back in the labor force. So there's all different kind of population subsets.
Right, sure.
But the initiative really was around how do we coax these people who are in Vermont to get them into the right job, but who may not be in Vermont, but who know Vermont because they vacation here, maybe they ski here, maybe they go
to
mountain
school.
climbing here, go to school here. How do we get them to get into the workforce? So that was part of the economic development bill.
That's great.
And my own view on that is that is one of the single most important components.
We were
of the
very
budget.
impressed with that, and I just am so big on tech ed. I come from a Swiss company years ago, worked there for 20 years, and the Swiss know how to do tech ed. And I think we should learn too, because our businesses need it.
Right.
They need folks who can have the skills.
And part of it also borrowed, in fact, on the German apprenticeship program.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Which brings people into the labor force and kind of gets them squared away.
Commissioner, you have been a delight. You've learned a lot.
This has been
My
fun,
goodness.
Ed.
Thank you so much.
This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you very
for,
much. Thank you for tuning in. You've learned so much, Commissioner. My goodness. Anyway, we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.